Hello all, welcome to the next episode of AWS User Group Punjab. Aaron is back again to share Pulse of Wisdom. He has been with us since the past few weeks. He has shared a lot about AWS Amplify. He's continuing to do so. On behalf of the whole AWS community, User Group Punjab community, we thank Aaron for your continued support. And
Pleasure.
in this talk, he would continue to build upon what he has done in the previous two talks. This talk is specifically focused on creating custom auth experiences using AWS Amplify. But there are also a few community questions that had come up when he presented the related topic. So we would also try to cover them. Aaron, should we instead start with the questions instead and then proceed with the custom auth experiences?
Let's get into some questions, make this a little bit more interactive.
Cool. So one of the queries was that if someone has already created an AWS Amplify project, he has created this API, and he wants to use the same API in another AWS project or maybe a non-AWS project whereby he just wants to consume the API that is created without having to deploy the front end on AWS. Is that possible? If yes, how can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tackle this in two different ways. There's the Amplify way, and then there's the non-Amplify way. So let's start with integrating with an application that's not using Amplify. Essentially, when you've created your resources through Amplify, it's creating the endpoints in your AWS account. So those endpoints are available as publicly accessible endpoints. Obviously, if it's Appsync or API Gateway, you've got the public URL. So in terms of integrating with an application that's not using Amplify, it's as simple as pick your library. You could write it, say in JavaScript. Let's just say you could do your own custom HTTP query to that API, or you could use Lodash is not the library that I'm thinking of. Axios. Let's just say you're familiar with the Axios library. You could use Axios to make a GET post request. If it's Appsync, it's always going to be a post request. So it's Axios post, and then you're sending a post to your Appsync endpoint, but then the actual body of that post will be a structured GraphQL query. So you're using the GraphQL syntax as the post body. If you're using REST API, API gateway, so as REST or as an API gateway proxy, it's the same as any API gateway or any RESTful resource. So you'd be making the API gateway as your URL, and then it can be a GET request, it could be a post request, whatever the resources that you've specified in your API gateway is what you would use in terms of your Axios query. So they would still need to be deployed. Like if you've developed them through your Amplify application, so you've gone ahead and built an Amplify backend. Remember, you don't actually have to build a front end. You can build a backend. Actually, let me jump into the console and demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about. So at the moment, if you remember from the previous two episodes, we've actually deployed an API. We're using Appsync, so it's a GraphQL API, and we've deployed authentication through the Amplify CLI. There's no requirement then to actually have a front end and build it in. And in fact, we haven't actually gone through and set up any front end link for our front end application. So the front end application at the moment is purely running on my local development machine. In a future episode, we'll look at Amplify hosting, and we'll look at tying together our front end and our back end through maybe a CI pipeline. Where using, say, GitHub, we've got the actual code already in GitHub, so we can connect the repo into our environment. We can set up a build pipeline all through Amplify so that it's managed. Every time we commit, it will run through the build and deploy it. And then it'll hook together our backend through. We can go in and do some configuration of the build to trigger the backend build every time we want to redeploy API gateway and stuff. All of those two things don't actually have to be joined together. You can have your Amplify managed backend. Once you've deployed things through the CLI, you might just want to keep it as Amplify for managing your backend resources, and then integrating your own custom web app and mobile apps, like I said, through Axios. The other way of handling it is, though, through Amplify, right? There's no need to use Amplify CLI and Amplify hosting for every application if you want to use the same resources. So say we want to use this same API and same authentication, but we want to develop a mobile app and we want to develop another web app or something. There's a couple of different ways of doing it, right? So first of all, we can go into our new application and we can do an Amplify pull and actually pull the name of the app and the environment, right? So we're working from dev, we could have a prod, whatever it is, but the important part here is the app ID. What this would actually do is this would pull down the entire, let me quickly jump into the code, pull down the entire Amplify backend here. And so then all of the configuration that we've done through Amplify, you would actually be able to continue adding to it through the CLI, making changes to, say, the GraphQL schema, and then pushing it into the app through multiple apps. Now, that can actually become a little tricky because now you've got multiple people working across multiple backends, which it's generally a good idea to have a CI pipeline to manage this, as opposed to direct app integrate, direct pull app, modify, and send if you've got two people working off the same backend. That's one way of doing it. So I would suggest, if you're going to manage your backend through multiple people, then do it through your CI. So you'd actually maybe create a mono repo style where your actual backend, so the actual Amplify folder, may be separated from the front end application, and you can have multiple front end applications in there as well. And then based on the commit, depending on the front end application that you're committing to, would then just run the build and deploy for just that front end application. And if there were back end changes needed, you would make a commit to the back end folder, which would then do a back end deploy. So that's a better way of approaching multiple people managing a backend. Now, that's one way. The other way is, let's just say you've got another team managing all of the backend stuff, and they've got their own front end application as well. So it's all managed the same way that we've done here. We've got one application managing front end and back end, but we now want to go ahead and create a mobile app or create another web app that's talking to the same API using the same auth. I wrote an article, Amandeep, if you want to drop that in the comments. I wrote this article in 2020. Let me just go back. I can see it on my other screen. I wrote this article in November of 2020, right? So this article describes integrating your existing resources. So you may have created them through Amplify for another app, but you're creating a new mobile app, new web app, and you want to use the Amplify SDKs, so we can take advantage of the libraries for querying Appsync and querying API gateway. But you actually you don't want to have to manage the entire backend. So all you really need is, let's go in the code and show you. All you really need is, what am I looking at here? App.js. We should have our import Amplify and Amplify exploits, right? So you just need the Amplify. We can actually do a Amplify configure. If you go through that article, it will show you actually one area where, instead of pulling in the exports, we're actually going through and adding our own API configuration. So you can actually configure endpoints is an array. So you can actually go and start configuring your endpoints for existing API resources that exist. So we'll give, where are we here? So API is actually, this is wrong. API is an object which has a property of, let's explode this out properly. So API is an object which has a property of endpoints. That's better.
Aaron, can you please zoom a bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's hide this and hide this for now. So here we go. You've got a Amplify configure. I want to say, add API. I know the name of it, right? So the name of the first one that I'm going to add is we're creating blog, right? So the name of the API is blog, and this is what we use to actually query it in our code, right? So blog, I just add the endpoint, not endpoints, and this would be my HTTP ://example. So this is the custom URL key that gets generated when you create a new API, and then the rest of it's for API gateway execute dash API dot and then the region. So let's just say I'm coming from Melbourne, so my closest region is AP Southeast East 2, and that's the general Amazon AWS.com. So that's the general structure of when you create an API gateway resource. So whether you've done it through the console or whether you've done it through Amplify, when it creates that public endpoint, it will give you your public endpoint key, the URL for API gateway, the region that you're in, and then it's all an AWS service. And then the most importantly is what's the resource. So we're calling this one blog, right? So that's a resource. Now, the reason we do it as endpoints here is because now we're actually adding custom URLs that we want to be able to talk to as blog resource, or we might add another one, which is name comments, and then it'll be the actual API key /blog/comments. So now we're actually adding individual resources. So from that, you can then actually start to use the Amplify libraries to call the actual API get on, let's just say, let's add it to, this is not going to work because this example URL doesn't work, but let's just say I wanted to do a query and I'm using let's quickly pull in API library. I want to use the API library. So I could simply go API dot, it's a REST resource, and we've added blog here as the resource name. So we're just going to go get. We're going to use the resource name blog. And then from blog, I want to actually call the sub-resource article. So I do article. And that's it. So then the rest would be like what do you do with it? So if it's a if you just want the whole object, this is a promise. So we would say like let article equal, this is actually getting a list. So this was articles, and then we'd say like, bang, we now have all of the articles from this URL /articles. So we can add all of the blog sub resources. If we had, article, if we had a specific ID, then we might put in like the ID of the actual article if we want to just pull one article. But for now, it's like a list of articles. And then obviously this is a promise. So we would, in an async function, we would then do, then, and then take the data and the like. I'm not going to go through and explain, like code this out because this resource doesn't exist. This is an example, but all I've done right now is I've said, all right, I'm using the Amplify libraries. I don't need to know about any Amplify backend. All I want to do is I want to start calling actual API endpoints, like an API gateway, pulling resources from it using get, and I can start working with the data that the API gateway returns. So that's the other way of integrating, whether it's been managed through Amplify or whether you've actually already got them in your AWS account. Any public endpoints that the Amplify SDK supports, which is like your API gateway, your Appsync, you can then add them through the config here in the same way that when you actually import the AWS exports, all of this information is added in the actual exports file. I'm not going to show you the actual exports file here because that'll give you my key and stuff, and then you'll actually be able to start going and hacking at my application. I want to use this same one as we go through this series without having to rebuild and refresh. So for now, if you build your own Amplify application, have a look at the AWS exports, so that gets generated when you actually are pushing your resources into Amplify and creating your backend. And that's where in the configure, we just drop the AWS exports here. Now, if I wanted to, I could actually combine the two together. I can actually say, you know what? I want all of the rest of the AWS exports properties plus the, that should be 3 dots. This is basically saying explode everything from AWS exports into this object and also add API. So I've now got access to everything else that's in my current Amplify application that we've created, plus an additional API endpoint of blog with my custom endpoint, whether it was through Amplify or manually created through the console. So that is the two main ways of working with existing resources, whether you're working with the Amplify library or not. And then obviously you can work with the Amplify library CLI and create a backend for your application like I've done in this one, or you can work with the Amplify libraries without the backend as long as you know the API gateway. And in this case, this is not going to use an API key. If I wanted to add API key, then I'd actually have to go and add that configuration in here as well, so that we know what the API key is when it makes the request. But it's the same way that we configure the actual structure of the AWS exports. So if we wanted to go and add the API key, we would add the API key for the actual API instead of using the Appsync API key. So you can see that's the current structure of what we've got in terms of what we're using for our Amplify app that we're building. Anyway, I'm going to backwards make all this disappear, but that essentially answers the using existing APIs in a new Amplify app using the Amplify SDK, but not managing through the backend through Amplify, or starting your own app and integrating with something like Axios or any other library that you're familiar with for making get and post requests. To post, obviously, if it's going to be a GraphQL query, better if you can use an existing GraphQL library, because then it helps you structure all of the request. But you can use Axios to do a GraphQL query as well, just remembering that you need to add all of the right content headers, and the actual body is the GraphQL syntax.
Yeah, that's going to be tricky.
It can be. Yeah, GraphQL's a little bit tricky to get your head around sometimes.
Yeah. Another question was, these are like public endpoints. What if we want to give specific domains the access and not the other domains?
Yeah, so if you want to wrap your public endpoint in a custom domain, then essentially that's when you use something like Route 53. So you can create a host header, not a host header. You can create a record in your hosted zone. So you have your let's call this our punjabugblog.com, yeah, or maybe it's the Punjab UG for user group, or it's Punjab AWS UG.com/blog. So for now, if we want to have an API, we might create a subdomain of API dot Punjab UG AWS UG.com. Actually, even better, I think you have the root domain IN for India, so Punjab AWS UG.in. API subdomain, and point that A record at your endpoint for your API gateway or your Appsync, right? Using Appsync, you can also create custom domains, so you can actually link a custom domain through Appsync, through the console, like through actually using Appsync, or you can do it through Route 53 with, say, API gateway and create the domain pointer that way. If you're creating your custom domains, I would have to check into, I can get back to this question too, around public private or allow less block list if you're actually wanting to make the actual domain blocked to anyone except the allow list. I know it's possible to do it. I just have to remember which way is the best way to go about doing it. So in terms of the API gateway, it is a public endpoint. You can create private endpoints, but then if we were to create a private endpoint, you would actually have to have a resource for your Route 53 to link to inside a VPC, which would then route to the API gateway. It's possible, it's just very complex. So most of the time when working with mobile and web applications, the API gateway endpoint is a a public endpoint, but then it's more the URL that you set through Route 53 is then the nice and easy to read one, and then you create the SSL connection between the API and the DNS, so the domain and the endpoint, and that way the termination at the API gateway is coming from that domain, so it's only recognized from that domain. That way, if you're coming from a different domain, it's going to say, well, no, this is not the accepted domain, and so you'll know that it's coming from a different domain. Yeah, but simple. I think I might have overcomplicated it by over-explaining it, but it's as simple as domain name to API endpoint.
Cool. Thanks, Aaron. Another request was to repeat the how we basically created the schema from scratch, and because at that time we were short of time and we had to rush through things, and
yeah, sure.
The request was to basically, the request was basically just to have a very simple example. Like if you just want to save something from the UI, be it just a simple record, we just want to store a table of records, say student records, right? How would the schema look like? We don't want the ask was not to go into the relationships, just start from there and see what are the auto-generated operations created if you are using a GraphQL Appsync.
Okay, so there's two ways of doing this, right? Again, there's the Amplify CLI way of doing this, or there's the manual doing it from scratch, right? Let's just say if we wanted to, let's say, so generally I would add a single AppSync and create multiple models, if that makes sense. So I would actually just amend this existing model and say, all right, I don't want to have any relationships. I just want to go and create a new model in my existing app endpoint that I can access from the same endpoint. If I was to do that, then I would start with this, right? Let's start with a blank screen. Let's just say, all right, everything Amplify allow public. This, you can ignore this at the top. So is that big enough? Let me zoom in a bit. You can ignore this at the top. You can ignore what we've done already. Let's just say you go into your, let's kill this. Yes, Amplify add API. And, ooh, it doesn't like that. Why not? Amplify, because I spelled it wrong. Add API, and it's going to come up and say, what do you want? So we want a GraphQL, yes. You already have an AppSync API in your project. Use the Amplify update API. Okay, so that's a good point. If we want to modify our existing API for the properties in terms of the types of auth, all that sort of stuff, I don't want to do that. I just want to update the model. So I'll show you how to do that in a sec. But stepping back to when we were creating our existing at the very beginning, the first episode, when we went and said GraphQL, we were then given some options, and we can start with a blank schema. We can start with a simple to-do list schema, or we can use a similar structure to the relational one, the blog, post, and comments. This one that we've created up here is slightly different to that one. But what I'm going to suggest is let's just start with blank. Yeah, so it's not going to have anything in it. We don't want it to do. We want to create a list of students. So what we do is we start with same deal. We want to create a model. So we say type, and the model is going to be called students. Let's say students. And we know we need to make it as a model. So when we say model, what that's doing is that's going to add the DynamoDB table on the back end, because this is how Appsync works, is that when we create an at model, it's not just a type, so a GraphQL type. We can create types without model and give it properties, but all it's going to do is it's going to create that type in the schema in Appsync. It's not going to link it to a DynamoDB table. So when we add that at model, it's now saying this type is linked to a data source, which is backed by DynamoDB. So now when we say, let's go and add an ID, which is this guy, this guy here, ID, when we say ID colon ID, and then so the exclamation is obviously it's a required field, but when we use the ID type here, it's saying that this ID is a recognized type, and that will be generated by our DynamoDB. So when we insert the record, that ID will be generated for us. So we actually don't have to add that to the query when we're creating doing a GraphQL mutation to create a record. Now you can override that. You can actually add an ID, but at this stage, we just want to say that we need an ID because we haven't created the model or the backend yet. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say name. So we want the students, let's start with first name. And that's going to be of type string. And let's just say that first name's not required, but we want to have a last name. And that's also going to be string, but we'll say, because it's a student, the important thing is we have their last name, because all we're going to say here is that this ID might be their student ID, and we need to know their last name. So student ID, last name, and probably another important one would be their university or school email. So that will also be a string. And that's also required. So now we actually have 4 properties: ID, first name, last name, email, of type model.
Typo.
Where's my typo?
That's case sensitive, right? Yeah, sorry.
It is, thank you. So we have 3 types of string. You know what? Let's just say we're going to use this for the system ID. So let's create a final one of student. Somehow that looks wrong to me. Student, that's correct. Yeah, student ID. And we're going to make this a number. I believe that's a type. Not int. Yeah, I've got too many. I'm pretty sure it's number. I've got too many languages and different syntax running through my head. It's not an int type. It should just be a number. All right. We'll know very shortly, because what I'm going to do is, instead of going into Amplify Update API, I've just created that new. Don't want to scroll. Just created that new model. So we've got a type of students. It's an app model. We've given it our properties. Now all we want to do is let's just do Amplify status just to see where we're at. Okay, so we can see that for our API, we've got an update waiting to be pushed. We haven't changed anything to our auth. So we can go ahead and say, oh, here you go. Here's another way of getting your endpoints, right? So from the back end, I've just done an Amplify status, and it's showing me I've already got an endpoint for my GraphQL, and that's my public key. So anyone who has that key can make a query to that GraphQL endpoint, that Appsync endpoint, and you'll have access to all of the data that I've made public. So that's fine. I'm happy for you also, if you want to go ahead and use Postman or something to do a query on that, and you'll use that key, and you'll be able to see any of the data that we've pushed into our blogs. That's fine, because all of our data at the moment is test data. And later in a further episode, we're going to do RBAC controls to show how we add access to certain like comments or posts or whatever. We might actually say that students later, once we've gone through the auth stuff, is only accessible to people who are logged in. But for now, all we're interested in is we've just created a new model. We've done status. We can see that it needs to update. So let's just do amplify push.
Typo.
Again. That's going in and updating. Yes, we want to update. And yes, we want to generate when it comes up. All right, cool. It's told us that that's an incorrect type. Unknown type of number. Just do a quick search.
Should be int within the capital I.
Yeah, okay, it is int. All right, cool. Let's double check. Yeah. Int. Yeah, cool. So retry that. This is a good example too of if you do make a mistake in your GraphQL, it will, before it even tries to push it in, it will actually run through and say, all right, this schema is not valid, so it's not going to push it in. So yes, we want to make that change. It's now going to validate the schema. The schema is okay this time, and then or it's still validating it, but no, it's sorry, it has validated it. So it schema compiled successfully. So we know it's a valid schema now, and it's now updating, pushing it into the backend. So what I'll do is, while that's pushing in, I do already have my console open, but I'm gonna jump over to Appsync. Open in a new screen. So I want to show you exactly what this is going to create. So I won't click on schema yet because I'll wait for it to finish. Where is it? And yeah, we want to generate the API side of things, right? So we'll override queries, that's fine. And remember I said if you want to modify the existing queries, then you take them out of the actual, let's look at this GraphQL folder. So this is the queries and mutations. Copy them out of these here. You can create your own custom GraphQL, and that's where you can then start to modify the actual queries themselves. You might say, well, for a specific type of query, I only want to return the ID, the title, and say the created at. Yeah. So then you can go and create your own custom one, move it into your own folder so that when you generate new ones, so as we're generating a new model, it'll go and create the mutations and queries for that model. It's not going to override any changes that you've made. So these in the, and you can customize this when you, oh, why did it open that up again? You can customize this when you actually create your app, where the folder goes and everything. So you can have your auto-generated schema, or so auto-generated queries and mutations, and then your manual ones that you've actually created yourself. But for now, we've just got all of our auto-generated ones. That's still going through and pushing the change into Appsync. This may take a few minutes. I doubt we're actually going to have a lot of time for auth, so I'm gonna say let's break this auth one into auth one and or auth A and auth B, or auth point one and auth point two, because
Sure.
what I'll do is I will go through once we've done this. If there's no more questions, we can just call this the question answering session, and because this is important, I would much rather cover what the user group is asking than pushing on and covering new stuff, because it's just going to raise more questions. And if we if we wait until the very end of building the app, all of these questions are going to take forever. So I'd rather cover off the answering of these questions before pushing on and giving you more questions to ask. But what we'll do is we'll cover off today's questions, and then I'll start by getting into the auth service stuff that we started last week and looking at building out the custom queries at the service layer. And then we will probably look at what I might do is I might look at doing just a component for a route, so we can demonstrate the difference between a public page and a page that needs authentication, and then we'll go in and start building out more of the application, like the login page, the sign up page, and all that custom stuff that we might do at the front end. So this will give you the integration and the way to send them to the login page, but then maybe next session we'll actually build the login, the sign up, and the pathway, the pathway that we looked at in last episode with the UI component. We'll do that by using our own custom pages.
Perfect.
And if you do get any more feedback from the user group, I love this, by the way. I love answering questions. It makes it more interactive. I'm making this stuff up as we go, right? So last week we looked at authorization and authentication and looked at the UI components. and I put the question to you, the user group, where do you want this application to go? So if you do want to see something more than, like if you don't really care about creating custom pages for login and update, I'm happy to keep using the UI components. And we can integrate, with custom auth services and show you how to do that with the UI components, or if you want to create your custom pages, let's do that. So tell MD, like feedback on what are the things that you want to see, and we'll build them. We'll do it the way that you want to see it, the way that maybe you're working in your customer environments or the projects that you're working on. If you need to tackle a specific problem with, as we go through this series of working with Amplify, we can tackle those problems, and make it work for you, as opposed to just me showing you the best practice way of doing things and then, forgetting about it, a couple of weeks later.
Great.
All right, so this hopefully will be done very soon. It's just doing the last update. So I love CloudFormation to bits. It's my absolute favorite stack management and state management of the stack for handling resources. But when doing it this way, it can be quite slow. It's the push, it's the wait, it's deploying everything. It's a great thing that it's actually doing it, but it takes time. So if I was to do, here we go. Now we have all of our queries. If I was to do a presentation style, then I would pre-bake all of this and have it all up and running in the back end, so we don't waste time going through the CloudFormation. But because we're answering questions, we're actually building something on the fly. It can take a bit of time. All right, so we now have the same endpoint and the same key, so you can go and query. We've created our students model. We've created our own custom properties. Now we'll jump back into the console and we can see schema. So we should now see where are we? Blog, comments, float. Okay, let's refresh. I think it didn't see it. Blog, comment. There we go. Create students. Where's the model itself? Here we go. Type model student connection. That's for a list of students. Mutation, create students, update students, delete students. So here's the mutations in your model that have been created based on that model. Here's the model itself. So this is the model we created. See how the type doesn't have app model here in the actual GraphQL schema in Appsync, because this is what I was saying, right? We create a GraphQL model as a type. Sorry, so we create a GraphQL type. So it's the student's type, which is the same as any language you would use. You create a strong type, you give it properties, you give it its what do you call it? The primitive types. So we know that it's got strings, it's got an integer, it's got automatically creates the created at and updated at and uses the AWS datetime string as the primitive type, because we created the model, we created the type as a model, so that when we actually create the actual record in the data source, we want to know when that record was created, and when we do a mutation, when it was updated. So those are automatically added for you when the type is created. And then, so we can even subscribe to on delete student, on update student. So all of the subscriptions are created for you. We'll probably cover that off in a future episode around subscriptions. So that's WebSockets, subscribing to data changes on the back end and on the front end. Update student input. So this is the query for actually updating a student. So that's parts of the mutation. We can see if we go into the student, create student, we just want the student model. Actually, let's just go straight to the data source, students table. So it's created a students table. If I was to go back to the schema and keep looking through that, we would find where it's linked the student model with the student data source. And so it's created the data source for us. Let's actually go to the DynamoDB table. So we can now see, now there's not going to be any items there, but we can see that it's created for us the students table. It's given it a unique identifier, and it's given us the dev environment. So if we were to create it for our production stage, it would be, you know, students, a different unique identifier, and prod. And that way we can manage it through the Amplify stages. And we've got our table, which is easily readable, and our unique identifier. Obviously, explore table items, it's going to be empty because we haven't put anything in there. But when we do put something in there, you'll know that it will be in the structure of, obviously, we haven't sent anything, but it will be in the structure of the students that we created. So it'll be ID. Actually, let's do that, right? We can do that in Appsync. So we can in Appsync, oh, whoops, we want to go back to the one we were in. We can do queries. So let's do a query on students. So let's use mutations, and let's do a list students. Why do oh, mutations. I want to get rid of my queries. I want to create a student. Here we go, create student. I'm going to input first name. No, I'm not going to do first name. I'm just going to do all of the required fields. And when we do that, I'm going to return, so email, last name, first name. I'm just going to return the student ID and the last name. So I'm going to create my own, let's actually say aaron.senf at university. It'll be a university, so it'll be .edu. That doesn't exist, by the way. There is no university of university. And then my student ID is, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So create mutation. So this is I love this thing, the query builder, right? So we can create queries on the fly. We're going to execute that query. It's using the API key that we've generated. So we can, if we had other authentication methods, we can select the authentication method we want to use, but we only have API key at the moment. I've run that query. It's based on the, you know, so this is what would actually be in the body of our post if we were to build this in our own application. And then it's returned exactly what it's asked for. I've asked for a return of student ID and return of last name, and it's gone and done a student ID and a last name. Now let's do a query. Let's add that. I can get rid of my mutations. I want to do a query. I want to list students. I want the email address, the actual record ID, and the student ID. That's all. And I don't need to filter or limit. I'm just going to do that. So let's execute that. I can see that I have a list of students, just the one. There's my unique identifier for our record, and that's my student ID. So let's quickly jump back over. Let's go the easy way. Jump back over. Now let's explore our items, and we can see there's our unique ID. It's the type of students created at. So there's our created at, the email address, the last name, the student ID, and the update. Now, actually, this is the good thing about a DynamoDB, right? So it's a key value pair table. So let's just quickly do another query. Let's do another mutation. Let's get rid of my queries. Oop. Didn't want to copy that. I just want mutations. Yep. I'm going to create another student. This time I'm going to list everything, create everything, sorry, and then I'm just going to list student ID and last name just to confirm. So this time it's, let's say, did I spell that right?
Yeah, it's
How do I spell
SNNGH.
GH?
Yep.
Amandeep Singh at university.edu. First name Amandeep. Last name Singh. Student ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. He's the next person that was added to the student body. We've got student ID, last name Singh. Now let's go and do our, actually we can skip the query because you know it's there, but what I want to show you is, let's rerun that query. Here it is, refresh. Now you can see the beauty of the key value pair database, so DynamoDB. It's now added the additional column because now the new record in there has an additional column. And you can see it's blank because I didn't add it for my name, but we now have a full record that we can query, which will return all of the properties. If we were to just query on this property, then it wouldn't return obviously the first name blank. It would just return obviously the columns that we want. So that's the awesome thing about a key value pair database. Now let's leave it at that. I believe that's covered off the question. If you want to just confirm, we looked at creating a model from scratch. Remember, we can go into Amplify API add, and we can do blank schema. The bare minimum that we need is a type with the app model to tell us that it's going to be backed by DynamoDB. By default, you always need an ID for a DynamoDB table, so that one's a required field, and then everything else is auto-generated for you. So the update, the created at, the updated at, that's auto-generated, and then the rest of the properties are as per whatever you want to add. And that's a GraphQL model from scratch.
Thanks, Arun. That's all from a queries perspective.
Awesome. I think we've only got about 15 or 10 minutes left, so I'm going to very quickly just jump into what we looked at quickly last episode, and I'm going to have a look at the actual auth service and what we can do in terms of adding our own custom auth service. So for now, let's take a look at where am I? I'm on the wrong screen. Oop, should be over here. Cool. So what we did last, let's rerun this. npm run start. What we did last episode is we created our very simple app. Remember, we had already the blog post and stuff. We built out the stuff. I'm already logged in because I was running it before. So let's quickly sign out. This is the Amplify UI component. If I wanted to create an account, I can, Amplify UI component. If I wanted to create an account, I can go through and add username, password, confirm password, and add an email address. It will then do the verify email. So I'll receive an email. I can then take that verification code, put it in, and that will confirm that I'm a real user. And then I can say, let's log in with the created user, sign in. That's going to then authenticate with Cognito and hand back the JWT token saying that you are an authenticated user. What we then did is, so that's using the custom UI components. What we then did is we created a custom button, which we feed the logout function to. And then we went a little bit further and we said, all right, let's pull the username from our own custom query. And we did that by, let's go back to the code. We created our auth repo. In our auth repo, this is where I've got it in two places now. So I'm going to get rid of it from here eventually. I don't think I need it here anymore. So let's remove it from here just to make sure that we're not. Let's save that, make sure that everything is still running properly. Yeah, good. See, we still have that, so I know where that's coming from. So the whole point of me, what I just did then is I want to demonstrate that we don't want to mix our Amplify SDK in with our application logic. We want to have it handled in what we're doing in our repo pattern, right? So we could have this as a simple service file. The reason it's a repo at the moment is because I am going to lead towards building out the repo pattern. as we go along. I am a big fan of Redux, so I can even, please tell me in the comments or reach out to Amandeep if you would like to see me actually implement the repo pattern into this, or if you'd like to see me just do it through service files. I can do it either way. I'm going to start with service files, and if we do add Redux, then I would progressively add to it to demonstrate how the Redux pattern works and why it's actually important to have an idempotent pattern to not make changes to the data and then push out, and we can actually handle it through controllers, which is very similar to the old MVC pattern. But the way that we can do that is we can step it up. So we add service files, then we add controllers, and then we add controllers and reducers, I should say, and then we add the views, so we can actually create the whole Redux pattern. But for now, what we've done is we've got our repo file, which is our service file essentially, and we created our, so it's just a very simple class. We're exporting it. We can even like clean up our code, and let's just export it up here, export default, get rid of that down there, because there's no reason to have it exploded out like that. So we're calling in Amplify, right? Amplify library and Amplify auth. We're actually doing our exports, import from our export here. So now the only thing that's tied to Amplify in our entire application is our blog and repo. Now, again, we don't want to have to multiply this every time. So we will host each of those repos under a service file later. And so we have the one import and configure, and then that hands through to our different repos, or it would actually be the other way around. We'll have one repo, and then we'll have our blog service and our auth service. But for now, we're just calling them all repo. So the configuration is done in one place. If we were to move away from Amplify, the only thing that we have to change is our repo, is our underlying service queries. The rest of the application can remain the same. What we did is we added our get user function, and all we've done for get user is essentially call the auth library. So it's already configured with the endpoint for Cognito, and then we're just getting the get current authenticated user. So we're depending on the fact that we've already logged in, and then we can get the current authenticated user. Obviously, because we haven't already, if we hadn't already logged in, we wouldn't be able to access the page that's accessing this, so it's not going to create any issues. But in the future, when we have a public page and a private page, if we called the get current authenticated user, that's going to create an issue because there is no get current authenticated user. It's going to be null, which is going to create this exception. But for now, because we're already authenticated, we can return the data. So that, again, for those who are unfamiliar, we're exploding the actual the data object. The data object. So all of the properties of that data object. This explodes it into the object that we're creating above. If we were using TypeScript, this would be done in a very different way. But thankfully, because we can use the generic nature of JavaScript, we can actually explode objects into other objects. So that just basically says, take all the properties of this and turn it into the object that I'm creating above. And we hand that back to, so all we've done is we've done in the use effect, we've said get user. Then, because it's an asynchronous function, when we get the data, set the user state. So we've got a use state for React. If you're unfamiliar with use state in React, there's a difference between React classes and React functions. When we work with React functions, we use state in this way. When we work with React classes, we use it through properties. So for now, use state, it's a function. We can set the state by this. When we create the use state object, it creates a function for setting the value. So this will allow us to set the value of, and this is the value property. So we create a constant of the value that we want and the constant of the function for setting the value. We can set the default value by providing that to the use state. At the moment, we're just going to say null. So if it's null, it doesn't do anything. I have to do a catch. If it's null, it won't exist, so it won't have a property of username. So this says if user is null, don't pull username. If it isn't null, then go and look for the username property. So all I'm doing is I'm saying of the user state, so of the application state, user property, get the username and print it out on the page. And remember from last episode, we just handed the sign out because that's being handed into the application. So that comes from the actual with authenticator. So when we wrap the app inside the with authenticator, one of the properties that it provides, and also we could actually say user here, because the with authenticator will do the same as this query that we've done here, right? So we could completely get rid of this as we did through the episode last time and present the user in this way. But because we're going through and creating our own custom functions, we want to do it this way. So now we can see the user, we can present the user to the username to the page, and then we can sign out by clicking on the button. Now, the next thing that I want to do, if we can cover it off in the next few minutes, because we don't have a lot of time, just checking the time, is essentially show you all we really want to do here is we're wrapping the AWS Amplify auth functions in our own functions, essentially. So I'm actually going to get rid of constructor because I want to make this a static class. So the way I do this, static, is for those of you who are unfamiliar, the difference between a standard class and a static class, which means you don't actually have to make a concrete of the class to access static properties. So if you have a static class, you can then you can just call the class functions without having to instantiate the class. So we'll make this easier to use by creating them as static functions. The first one that I want to do, we've already got get user. That's going to be an important one later, but probably the most important one that we want to create is logging in, right? So we'll cover off registering and everything later, but we just want to create the login function because we'll use that for actually providing a path to, or a function to log in when we're on the login page. When we're on a private page, or when we hit the URL for a private page from a public, so somebody who's not logged in. So we can now start to differentiate between public pages and private pages. So all we need to do is we're using username and password, the two properties. And that's it. So all we need to do is as simple as auth dot sign in is the actual. So you can see here, sign in, sign out, and sign up. Sign in, and that's all we need to do is pass username and password to the sign in function. Now, the beauty of the Amplify library is that if we had configured it from the non-standard way of doing it and said that we actually want to use the email address as the primary login identifier, not a username. So you can do that. You can say email address is the username, then we would provide email address as the option here, and then set password. So then the configuration will know that the username or sign-in options is email instead, and so then it will use the email address to then hand through to Cognito. So that's it. Basically, that is now going to allow us to query Cognito and say sign in using the username and password that we receive from the login form. Now, the next one that I'll add now, just for today, because we're running very short on time, is going to be the exact opposite. So it's log out. So let's do async log out. And let's say, no, I don't need to, whoa, what happened there? Log out. I don't need to provide any properties because I'm not going to do anything with it. So how am I going to do this? There's a couple of different ways of, all right, so we're not going to work with session at the moment. So for now, I'll just return, I can add session later when if we add the Redux pattern and we want to handle user management of different user properties in the session. But for now, we'll just do the basic transactional functions with Cognito. So we've got the user being managed actually in Cognito, which means when we do the get user, it will just query Cognito to get the current user, and then it'll just be in the state of the current page. So if you refresh the page, then it would have to redo the query to go and get it from the side. If we wanted to manage it a little bit more efficiently, we can create a session object or a session storage and add that user to that session storage. So then we can actually modify this to say, instead of going and querying Cognito every time, we just look at the session storage variable and see whether it's there. If it's not there, then they're logged out. And what we would do then is here, we would remove user from session. Yeah. And here, after we would do you'd actually do it after this bit, but we would not return this. We would say add user to session. So we'll play with that later. But for now, we've got two very simple queries to the Amplify API. We've got sign in and sign out, and we're covering that now as our static properties log in and log out for our own service class. And unfortunately, I had planned a lot more for tonight, but that's all we have time for tonight. What I will do is show you the difference between how I had the auth repo is new auth repo. Now that it's a static class or static functions, I can get rid of that and I'll use it directly here. So now we're just calling auth repo get user. And essentially, if we wanted to, we could say auth repo.login and provide if we wanted to hard code the login every time, we could provide my user here and the password. But we're not going to do that. But you can see now that these static properties allow us to add our username and password, right? They allow us to do our get query without having to instantiate the class. So we now have no dependency on Amplify in our application at all until we get down to the actual service layer. So just very quickly, I'm going to save that. I'm not sure why it's got the red. I think that's just because it's got spaces. But I'm going to make sure that that's still running properly. Auth repo get user. Where's my browser? Refresh this page, and I can see, yeah, I'm still logged in. Let's sign out. Let's log in again. Oops. Cool. So we know that now our code is coming from our static function, which is a wrapper on top of our Amplify auth functions. In this case, we're just using the get current user. But in next episode, we will start to expand on login. And what I'm going to do is, if I quickly go in here, you can see how we've got the React router. What we'll do is we'll expand on the route component, and we'll actually make what we call a auth route. So basically, when somebody hits an auth route, if they're not authenticated, it will send them to a login page. So we'll also have to create a login component, or a login page, sorry, and an auth route component. And so that way we can actually tie those to our login. So when we hit the private page or the auth route page and it redirects us to login, we can then do the login in the same way that we've got our login component for the main page, but then we can actually remove our with Authenticator and stop using the actual auth UI component and start wrapping the auth or adding the auth route here to allow us to send to check, are they authenticated? Yes, they are. Show them the page. No, they're not. Now let's send them to the login page. And then we can add the register page as a link to the login page in the same way that the actual authenticator does. And that's how we do custom components and allow us to do, instead of wrapping the entire app with Authenticator, we can actually now start to specify, we'll make the home page public. We'll make the admin page private. We might even make the posts by ID public, but we'll make adding a new post private, and then so that's the post for blog. Sorry, we'll make that. So we'll make some of these public and some of these private. But unfortunately, I believe that's all we have time for today. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amandeep.
No, we are out of time today.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for all the questions. Apologize that we didn't get into the auth stuff that I had planned, but I'm very happy to pick that up next time.
Thanks, Arun. Thanks for all these sessions, and hope to see you in the next session. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks,
And thanks all for the questions.